Once he's dead, he's taken off the cross and wrapped in cloth and taken to a borrowed tomb.
And because of the contact with the body of Jesus, that transforms and leaves a lasting mark on the cloth.
For nearly 2,000 years, one mysterious piece of cloth has raised a question that science still hasn't been able to silence. Are we looking at the greatest religious relic in history, or one of the most convincing mysteries ever created? The Shroud of Turin has been examined by historians, photographed by scientists, tested in laboratories, and debated by experts across the world. But beneath the visible image lies another story, one written in microscopic dust, pollen, blood, fibers, and traces of human DNA. And when researchers began studying those invisible clues, they discovered something unexpected. The shroud appeared to carry a biological record of the people and places it had encountered over centuries. Some of those traces seemed to point toward regions far from where the shroud was traditionally believed to have originated. Others raised questions about contamination, human contact, and the long journey of the artifact itself. But here's where the mystery becomes even deeper. Can DNA really tell us where a 2,000-year-old cloth came from? Or are scientists simply reading the fingerprints of everyone who touched it along the way? Today, we're going inside one of history's most controversial scientific mysteries, the DNA of the Shroud of Turin. And by the end, you'll understand why the evidence doesn't simply support one side of the debate. Instead, it opens a mystery even more complicated than the one scientists were trying to solve. Let's begin with the object at the center of it all. The Shroud of Turin is a long rectangular piece of linen cloth, approximately 14 feet long and 3.5 feet wide. It is kept in a specially designed silver case inside the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist in Turin, Italy. When you look at it under ordinary light, you see a faint brownish image of a human figure, front and back. The figure shows a bearded man. There are marks on the head consistent with something like a crown of thorns. There are wounds on the wrists and feet. There are marks across the back consistent with severe beating. There's a large wound on the side of the chest, and there is no paint, no pigment, no dye. The image is not drawn onto the cloth. It appears to be embedded into the top layer of the fibers themselves at a depth so shallow that even the most powerful microscopes struggle to explain how it was produced. This is not a normal painting, and for more than 600 years, nobody has been able to explain with certainty what it is. The first time the shroud appears clearly in recorded history is around 1353 in France, in the possession of a French knight named Geoffroy de Charny. From there it moved to Lirey, then to Chambéry, then to Turin in 1578, where it has remained ever since. Millions of people have visited during its rare public exhibitions. Some arrive as pilgrims, experiencing what they describe as a powerful emotional and spiritual encounter. Others arrive as scientists, treating it as an unsolved forensic case, one of the oldest and strangest in human history. The Church itself has never definitively claimed the shroud is authentic. A cardinal in the 1980s described it as a historical symbol rather than a verified religious relic, but the Church has also never dismissed it. And the reason is simple. Science has not been able to dismiss it either. The year 1898 changed everything about how people understood the shroud. An amateur Italian photographer named Secondo Pia received special permission to photograph it during a public exhibition held under King Umberto I. Photography in those days was nothing like today. Heavy equipment, glass plates, chemical development by hand in a darkroom. Pia set up his large camera inside the cathedral, used strong magnesium flashlights to illuminate the cloth, and carefully exposed 2 large glass plates, each nearly half a meter long. He took the plates back to his dark room. In the dim red light, he lowered the first plate into the chemical solution. He waited. And as the image slowly developed, he felt his hands begin to shake. Under normal circumstances, a photographic negative reverses the tones of the original image. Light becomes dark, dark becomes light, and what you see looks strange and artificial. But what Pia saw in his negative was the opposite of strange. It was more real than the original. The face that appeared in the negative was not flat or distorted. It was clear, 3-dimensional, deeply detailed, as though it were a straight photograph of an actual human face rather than a negative of a painting on cloth. Closed eyes, a scar on the nose, a beard, the expression of a man who had endured something enormous and remained somehow at peace. Pia was so stunned he nearly dropped the plate. When he reported what he had seen, many people assumed he was either exaggerating or lying. It took years before independent researchers confirmed it. The image on the shroud behaves like a photographic negative. This meant that whoever produced the image, however they produced it, somehow created a negative image on cloth at a time in history when photography did not exist. No one has fully explained how. From that point onward, science and the shroud became inseparable. Over the next century, the cloth was examined using X-rays, ultraviolet light, infrared imaging, laser scanning, and spectroscopy. Every test revealed something new. Every answer raised new questions. The image is not painted. The fibers within the image areas have been chemically changed at the surface level. The top 200 nanometers of the outermost cells of the linen fibers, in a way that produces the brownish discoloration we recognize as an image. Scientists at the European Synchrotron Radiation Facility published research in 2018 suggesting that the image could theoretically be recreated through a very intense, very brief burst of ultraviolet radiation, like a laser pulse. But the energy needed to create that effect across the shroud's entire body image would be far beyond anything a medieval craftsman could have produced. Far beyond what even modern technology could generate uniformly across a 14-foot piece of cloth. Some researchers have suggested that the energy needed to form the image may represent something that physics cannot yet completely explain. They say this without religious intent. They say it as scientists. And the statement remains in the literature unchallenged, because no one has offered a better explanation. Now, let's discuss the DNA research, because this is the investigation that produced the findings that silenced the room. In 2015, a research team based at the University of Padua in Italy conducted one of the most ambitious scientific investigations of the shroud ever attempted. Their goal was not to prove or disprove the shroud's authenticity. Their goal was to use DNA analysis to trace the cloth's journey, to discover where it had been, who had touched it, and what its fibers had quietly collected through centuries of travel and contact. They used ultra-clean specialized equipment to collect microscopic particles from the surface and between the threads of the fabric. The collection process was painstaking. Contamination is the greatest enemy of ancient DNA analysis. Any modern particle, any breath, any fragment of skin from a contemporary researcher can contaminate the ancient signal. The team worked under strict protocols. They used vacuum collection devices with ultrafine filters, and they analyzed particles gathered during previous restoration work. They performed next-generation sequencing, NGS technology, which can read millions of tiny fragments of genetic code simultaneously and reconstruct the patterns they represent. Then they compared those patterns against global genetic databases representing populations from every region of the world. And what they discovered was not what anyone expected. If the shroud had been created by a medieval forger in France or northern Italy around 1350, the genetic signature would be dominated by Western European DNA. French, Italian, perhaps some broader European variation from pilgrims who visited it during the 200 years it remained in Europe before the DNA study. And there was indeed European DNA on the cloth. That was expected, but European DNA was nowhere near the whole picture. The researchers identified genetic signatures associated with populations from the Middle East, specifically markers that match the Druze community, a population that has lived in the mountainous regions of Israel, Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria for centuries, with relatively little outside genetic mixing. The presence of Druze-associated markers is considered by genetic researchers to be a strong indicator toward that specific geographic region, because the relative isolation of this community means their genetic profile has remained stable and distinctive. So, the cloth carries markers pointing toward the Levant, the region where Jerusalem is located, but it did not stop there. Genetic traces connected to North Africa and East Africa were also present, markers associated with populations in Egypt and Ethiopia, regions that had major early Christian communities. There were genetic signatures from South Asia, markers common in the Indian subcontinent, and most strikingly, there were traces connected to East Asian populations, including markers linked to Chinese genetic lineages. Pause on that for a moment. A cloth that researchers initially assumed might be a European medieval forgery carried DNA from China, from India, from East Africa, from the Levant, from Europe. The question that any honest scientist has to ask when confronted with those results is simple. How? A medieval forger working in France around 1350 would have been exposed to European DNA. He might have had limited contact with Mediterranean populations through trade routes, but genetic material from India and China on a cloth created in 14th century France is not something that normal medieval European life would have deposited. These are not regions that French craftsmen casually encountered. These are regions connected to the ancient Silk Road, the network of trade routes that linked Europe to the Middle East, Central Asia, South Asia, and China across the first and second millennia. The DNA pattern on the shroud matches the geographic footprint of the Silk Road far more closely than it matches the geographic footprint of medieval France. This is where an ancient historical account becomes scientifically relevant. Byzantine and Syrian sources from the early medieval period describe a cloth that was kept in the city of Edessa, now Sanliurfa, in modern Turkey, which was one of the major hubs along the Silk Road during the 1st century. This cloth was called the mandilion, and later the tetradiplon, meaning folded in four to reveal only the face. According to these accounts, the cloth had been brought from Jerusalem. It attracted pilgrims and traders from across the known world. If people from China, India, Persia, Arabia, and Africa passed through Edessa along the Silk Road, if they stopped to view and touch this cloth as they moved through the city, then their skin cells, their perspiration, and the microscopic particles they carried would have been deposited onto the cloth's surface over decades and centuries. Each encounter would have added another genetic layer. Century after century, the cloth would have collected what the researchers discovered, not the signature of one person, one culture, or one geographic region, but a layered archive of humanity's contact with a single object over an extended period of time. The cloth reportedly moved from Edessa to Constantinople, the Byzantine capital, which was the greatest city in the world between roughly the 6th and 12th centuries. It was a crossroads of international commerce and culture on a scale that few cities throughout history have matched. If the cloth was publicly displayed there, the scope of genetic contact would have expanded even further. In 1204, during the Fourth Crusade, Constantinople was sacked and looted. The cloth vanished from historical records. It reappears in France in the mid-14th century, eventually making its way to Turin. If this journey is accurate, if the cloth traveled from Jerusalem to Edessa to Constantinople, to France, to Turin, then the genetic diversity discovered on its fibers is not a mystery. It is exactly what you would expect from an object that spent centuries in some of the most internationally connected cities in the pre-modern world. The pollen evidence adds another dimension that is independent of the DNA findings, but points in the same direction. Two separate researchers, Max Frey-Sulzer and Avinoam Danon, examined microscopic pollen grains trapped within the shroud's fibers using a process called palynology. Between them, they identified 58 distinct plant species represented in the pollen collected from the cloth. Some came from European plants, consistent with the cloth's European history since the 14th century, but most came from plants native to the Middle East, Turkey, and the Anatolian region. Several came from plants that grow only in a very specific and narrow geographic area, the region between Jerusalem and Jericho. One plant in particular drew significant attention, Gundelia tourneforti, a thorny desert shrub native to that region. Its pollen was present in large quantities across the cloth. Present in nearly half of all samples examined, it was concentrated particularly around the head and shoulder area of the figure on the cloth. Gundelia tourneforti is a thorny plant with long, stiff, needle-like thorns strong enough to be bent into a circular shape. Researchers familiar with ancient Roman practices noted that the thorns of this plant would be physically capable of being formed into a crown, the kind of crown of thorns described in the Gospel accounts of the crucifixion. The pollen of this plant is produced in early spring, around the time of the Jewish Passover festival. A second plant, Zygophyllum dumosum, also appeared in the analysis. This plant grows only in a very limited geographic region, the Judean desert and the Sinai. Its presence on the cloth offers another botanical clue pointing to the same area. A medieval forger working in France in the 14th century would not have had access to pollen from plants that grow only in the Judean desert between Jerusalem and Jericho. Pollen cannot be applied using a brush. It cannot be mixed into paint. It is deposited naturally when a plant blooms nearby or when a person or object that has been in contact with a flowering plant touches a surface. Pollen discovered on a 14th century cloth in France, pointing specifically to plants that bloom only in Jerusalem during spring, is not a detail that forgery can explain. It is a detail that physical presence in that region can explain. And then there is the blood. The stains that appear on the shroud in positions corresponding to the wounds described in the crucifixion accounts. For years, some researchers suggested the stains might be paint or dye, ochre, cinnabar, or other red pigments used by medieval artists. In 2017, a study using modern analytical equipment examined the stains at a much smaller scale than had previously been possible. The results confirmed the presence of actual human blood, not paint blood. The blood type was identified as AB, a relatively uncommon type that has also been reported in other ancient Christian relics, though that connection is noted without being overinterpreted. But the chemical composition of the bloodstains revealed information that went beyond the basic identification. Within the blood, researchers found elevated levels of creatinine and ferritin nanoparticles. These are not substances associated with a peaceful or natural death. Creatinine and ferritin appear in elevated concentrations in the blood of individuals who have suffered severe physical trauma, torn muscles, heavy blood loss, dehydration, and systemic physical breakdown. The medical term associated with this pattern is rhabdomyolysis, a condition that occurs when muscle tissue is severely damaged and releases breakdown products into the bloodstream. Analysis of the wound patterns on the shroud has identified evidence consistent with more than 100 separate injuries on the figure, a pattern that researchers have compared to descriptions of Roman flogging. An artist can paint the appearance of wounds. An artist cannot reproduce in paint the specific chemical profile of blood that has been produced inside a body experiencing catastrophic physical trauma. And these chemical signatures can only be identified using microscopes and modern analytical equipment that did not exist in the 14th century. What about radiocarbon dating? The 1988 test that seemed to settle the debate. In 1988, samples from the shroud were taken and sent to 3 independent laboratories: Oxford, Zurich, and Arizona. Each lab used accelerator mass spectrometry to measure the ratio of carbon isotopes within the fibers. The results from all 3 labs placed the origin of the cloth between 1260 and 1390, medieval, not ancient. The announcement was widely reported. Many people concluded the debate was finished, but the scientific community did not accept the result as final. Not because scientists wanted to believe in the shroud's authenticity, but because several serious problems with the methodology were identified in the years that followed. The most critical problem was the location from which the sample had been taken. The 1988 sample came from a corner section along the edge of the cloth, an area that had been extensively handled during centuries of public display, restoration work, and examination. Chemical analysis later revealed that this corner section had been repaired at some point. New threads had been woven into the older fabric, creating a hybrid area that contained both medieval and potentially older material. Carbon dating measures the ratio of carbon isotopes within the sample. If the sample contains a mixture of original ancient fabric and medieval repair material, the dating result will reflect that mixture, making the original cloth appear younger than it actually is. Some researchers have estimated that even a small percentage of newer material woven into older threads could shift the apparent date by several centuries. The 1988 result is therefore considered by a significant portion of the scientific community to be inconclusive rather than definitive. Not because the laboratories made an error, but because the sample they tested may not have represented the original cloth. What we are left with, after more than a century of scientific investigation, is a cloth that behaves unlike any other known artifact. Its image remains unexplained, produced by a process that modern physics cannot fully explain, and that medieval technology certainly could not have created. Its pollen record points specifically to plants that grow only near Jerusalem and bloom in early spring. Its DNA record carries genetic signatures from populations spread across the ancient Silk Road corridor from the Levant to East Asia. Its bloodstains contain the chemical signature of catastrophic physical trauma rather than applied pigment. Its radiocarbon date has been challenged on valid methodological grounds. And its physical history, moving from Jerusalem to Edessa to Constantinople to France to Turin, matches the genetic and botanical evidence more closely than any alternative explanation does. None of these findings prove the shroud is what believers claim it to be. They are not meant to. Science does not prove miracles. But these findings, taken together, have prevented science from dismissing the shroud in the way many hoped it would when the laboratory doors first opened. The cloth remains what it has always been, an object that raises a question no one has yet been able to fully answer. And the DNA evidence extracted from its fibers in 2015 did not close that question. It deepened it. It extended it backward across 2,000 years of human contact, human history, and human longing. And the researchers who conducted that analysis are still thinking about what they discovered. If you made it to the end of this video, you now know more about the Shroud of Turin than most people who have spent years discussing it. Subscribe to this channel and hit the bell so you don't miss the next investigation into the stories that science is still trying to explain. I'll see you in the next one.